Hi, I'm Mike Lerner. I'm one of the directors of Pussy Riot Punk Prayer, and thank you all for coming here today to show your support. I mean, you don't have to see the film to understand how incredibly important these women are and what a service they've done to mankind. So carry on with your support, and if you do see the film, I hope you enjoy it.
Hello, my name is MAXIM POZDOROVKIN. I'm one of the directors of Pussy Riot, and keep fighting the feminist revolution.
Okay, so let's start by talking about today, first of all. I mean, how are you feeling about now showing the film as the UK premiere at Sheffield?
Well, Sheffield's really one of the best documentary festivals in the world, no question, and over the years it's just got stronger and stronger, and it really is one of the most exciting places in Britain, that's for sure, and if not anywhere in the world to show the film. You've got such incredibly informed audiences. Most of the audiences here are filmmakers. I mean, there are some local Sheffield people, but on the whole, there's a great vibe here, so we're looking forward to it very much.
And there's a punk rock spirit, which is incredibly appropriate for our film, so there you go, there's no better place.
Well, let's wind the clock back a bit. I mean, you've been working on this for a while now, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about your personal attachment to the themes in the film and how you came to deciding that this was definitely going to happen as a feature documentary. Mike, if you could talk first of all about that.
Well, when you first see the images of Pussy Riot, it doesn't take very long to understand what an impactful and important and incredible story they are. And of course, as time went on, and they were arrested, and they were charged, and they were tried, and they were convicted, and imprisoned, it became increasingly obvious that this was really one of the stories of the decade, and it spoke personally. I'm sure Max would agree, to our own political and philosophical beliefs. I mean, I've spent a lot of my life making films about art and politics and where the two meet. And of course, the two meet very effectively in Pussy Riot. So, there really wasn't another film we were going to do this year. It had to be that.
And for me, I grew up in Moscow, so for me, the story was personal in all these other ways, because I grew up listening to kind of the same, probably punk rock records as they did, and being interested in Russian avant-garde art and its traditions and its kind of continuation, as well as I remember arguing with my mother of all people about the importance of feminism for Russia, and so I feel like, and then meeting the women and their parents and finding out a lot of similarities in that way, because I think we also grew up through similar times in the 90s as well in Russia, so there was kind of an immediate sense of kinship in addition to all the kind of the political and aesthetic interests.
Do you remember the moment where you saw images of Pussy Riot, or you heard that something had been going on, or you started, I assume it was way before they were arrested, that you started picking up on?
Their career was just, they started in November, and then by February they were in jail, so...
Yeah, everybody remembers the first time they see Pussy Riot, I think, it's I mean, you print, images in the British press of their various actions. I mean, the Red Square one in particular, I mean, that's just an incredibly iconic image. So yeah, they were an instant classic, and as I say, very hard to ignore, impossible to ignore. Yeah.
Quite difficult to dislike, actually, wasn't it? Especially if you're a fan of music and that era.
It always surprises me, the people that don't somehow get them and don't seem to instinctively support them. I mean, they do exist, these people, but...
Yeah, well, there are more of them than you actually would believe, even in the West, because, and one of the things in the film that was very important for us is that, Pussy Riot, as performance artists, they're very aware and they're very open about the fact that they use vulgarity as a tactic. That's their approach to the subject matter. That's what they are trying to provoke people. They're trying to offend people. They're trying to offend good taste, as Nadezhda did, as well as avant-garde artists have always done. And so, for us, it was important to not lose track of that and not to just present them as martyrs, because they are genuinely provocative and they are more radical than most people are comfortable with, and that's very important, and that's why they are people who push the boundaries of what's acceptable and actually transform society. So
it's quite interesting, isn't it, that you started off with the girls at the beginning. Actually, I quite like the way you started off, but it gives clarity to the fact that, as you said, that they were perfectly aware of what they were doing, what they were trying to achieve, the questioning about what does riot mean to you, and they don't seem to blink really in talking about what they're doing.
No, absolutely. Yeah, they're very aware, but they're looking for an alternative avenue for political protest, and they find that in art because legitimate avenues have been either suppressed or have been kind of coerced and made ineffective. And so for them, yeah, they're very aware that it's only through creating a certain kind of new visual iconography that you can transform society. And Mike and I, what we always talk about is that what's interesting is they remind us that art can transform society and can have a political impact in a way that very, very few people in recent memory have done.
Just to go back to the conversation you had with your mother, sorry, the argument about feminism was what exactly? Do you remember?
Well, I mean, specifically, she is a feminist, and she works with women's reproductive rights, even. But she was more reluctant about feminist philosophy, and it's a strange thing in Russian culture because there was a major wave of feminism around the revolution, 1917, and even before. So it becomes the first. Soviet Union becomes the first European country to give women the right to vote, to have easy access to abortions and easily obtainable divorce. And then Russia never had a second wave of feminism in a major way that you had here in the 60s and 70s. And so it remains a very patriarchal country for other reasons as well. And and for women also, Orthodoxy is a very patriarchal religion. And so I think that Russia just tends to be more conservative. And
it's very interesting because there are so many questions you could ask about this documentary and how you went about it. But one of the things I wanted to ask was in terms of the difficulties in Russia, not with getting people on board the project, but more getting to the bottom of what was actually going on with the women, say behind the scenes. Like there were so many rumours in the press of over here of what might be going on. And, for example, what difficulties did you feel almost were a real challenge to get to the bottom of? For example, the lawyers who were dismissed, I suppose. There's a real grey area there about what exactly happened, and then of course you see them in the documentary. But how difficult did you find it to kind of really just get to the bottom of how this was all fitting together? Was it quite evident, or was it really tricky?
Well, I mean, it kind of evolved. It was a constantly evolving thing, and it's interesting that nobody really knew what was going on. Certainly, what's fascinating is that the three women were largely ignorant of so much that was going on within this trial, and is when they come together in the courtroom that they actually, and their lawyers tell them stuff, that they actually know what's going on. So, and of course, nobody knew the direction that this trial was going to go in, how long it would take, exactly what the process would be. So everybody was sort of playing catch up with it, really, and you just had to stick to it and stick with it. And in terms of access to the process, that was relatively simple, and indeed those lawyers love to talk, so there's no question of them not participating or whatever. And yeah, there was this confusion or this kind of disruption that happened at the end, and Katya sacks her lawyer for a number of reasons. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, the fact is that the original lawyers, just settled on an approach that ultimately didn't work. And I guess if they'd have had their time again, they may have done it differently. But it was a very politicised trial. They're very political lawyers. I mean, they're civil rights, human rights lawyers. So I think they felt so kind of helpless, really, in this situation, that they would just turn the whole thing into an excuse for rhetorical challenge. Which ultimately nobody was really listening to, and certainly the judge wasn't listening to. So,
and I think it also, going back to this, for us, the idea from the beginning was that to make the most feminist film possible, and the way to do that seemed by giving as much of a voice to the women themselves as possible. And so what we tried to do is really to make an immersive film where their message comes through through what they say in court, through their artwork, through those things, rather than, because even if you had let's say a female expert explaining the situation or analyzing what was happening, that would feel like a strangely chauvinist way of doing it. I mean, because it's really us directing their message, and so from the beginning we really wanted to do this. And yeah, there are certain things that are unclear, and even the procedural stuff with the story of who initially initiated the criminal proceedings against them, and the role that the patriarch played, the role that the people who were inside the cathedral at the time when they performed, the role, and we met them and we interviewed in the film. But digging through all that did take some time and some kind of access and some. But as a result, a lot of these things we would find out for ourselves because it felt like things that we should know, and sometimes they didn't matter for the film as such, or they weren't as interesting as one would hope.
I mean, what is interesting is the degree to which these three women controlled the proceedings themselves and really directed proceedings and were constantly challenging what was happening. And some of the best moments in the film are when this whole process is being scrutinised and challenged by very clever minds, and the whole thing is exposed as ultimately being a political farce, which I think is a fair characterisation of it. So yeah, nobody knew what was going on. Everybody, everybody was sort of blaming or expecting the other side in a way to sort of drive it. So it's fascinating.
It's quite a fascinating film because you do get this feeling of this almost a real life game being played, and that the women are really perfectly aware of this game, and you as filmmakers are not completely sure what this game is and who are the players, but it's just fascinating viewing.
But also the game is ultimately a lot more, I think, interesting and nuanced and richly layered than has been presented in the press. And so for us it was, first of all, important to include moments where their lack of awareness about what's going on and about them being presented to the world on these things is clear, and also to dive a bit deeper and to try to uncover some of these other layers, because it is such a rich story. We were doing an interview with Katya last week, one of the members. I mean, she said that you could make so many different films about the story just because there's so much actual information and backstory and cultural background that needs to go in there to even have a kind of a basic understanding of the story.
Is it true you're thinking of doing more?
Oh yeah, if we can, we certainly will. But I mean, ultimately the point is, what and who is on trial in that courtroom, and that's why it is a fascinating insight into the psyche of contemporary Russia. And I mean, so they decide to have this trial, but really they're exposing all these fault lines that exist within society, and you really do have two Russias on trial. You have the future progressive, feminist, revolutionary, rejuvenating Pussy Riot, and then you have the stultifying, censoring, backward-looking, chauvinistic, misogynistic orthodoxy. So
and majority,
and so the question is, what does Russia want to be? That's what Pussy Riot are really asking.
And in a way, that conflict goes way back. It's such an iteration of a conflict between Western kind of movements and essentially more traditional Slavophiles, and this is something that's, funnily enough, reappears every 100 years in Russian history. So you have it in the 18th century, you have it in the 19th century, you have it in the 16th century. This major conflict between sort of pro-Western forces, usually coming out of St. Petersburg, and then more traditional kind of forces.
So the question is who won in this case, and obviously Pussy Riot won 1-0 basically, because morally, historically, they've changed the nature of this discourse in Russia, and even more importantly, I think, internationally, where a new and vibrant militant feminism is now really very much on the agenda and very much controlled by the people who are doing it, and it's not an academic exercise. It's very much a homemade, handmade, get involved situation.
That's something that you discovered during the process of the filmmaking. But do you think that the impact of the trial and the media coverage, and even the knowledge that a documentary is being made, do you think there has been a change even since then in terms of the visibility has helped a kind of movement to start becoming more visible, that it was already emerging but now it's kind of...
Well, I tend to think that, in terms of who won, and in terms of, it is a question of also time scale. I think that in the short term, in many ways, one could also argue that the church has won because they've managed to use this to pass through anti-blasphemy laws and laws against offending the feelings of believers, and there has been sort of a conservative shift. But I think that if you look at Russian society since then, I think a lot of people started out, maybe 60 or 70% of people started out being against them very much. I think because it became this soap opera that's constantly in the news, I think that people realized that the punishment was excessively harsh and all these things, that these women are actually patriots and very nice people and were motivated by the right things. And so I think that that's going to be a slower transformation. And likewise with opposition movement, the opposition movement flared up when Putin was returning back to power, and there was this kind of moment in Moscow and St. Petersburg of a resurgence of essentially opposition. It has somewhat died down since, but I think that it's retreated and it will come back. And I think that Pussy Riot was a point where there was increased radicalization in society on the left and on the right. Mm-hmm. And I think that now they're regrouping, the forces are regrouping. There's another protest today, and hopefully, I think that they are very aware that they're playing the long game. I mean, even artistically, they always talk about that. They were perfectly happy to just convince people one by one with one performance at a time. They weren't looking for this kind of lightning exposure. But since it's happened, now they're trying to figure out how to go on.
You talked about Russia and how things have emerged over there, but of course the last few days there's been the protests and quite violent clashes with the new legislation about, that you can't verbalise, you can't, they call it propaganda, don't they? You're not allowed to talk about homosexuality to minors. And I saw some of the visuals of the clashes and really very, very disturbing images of attacks on young people, and it's very fierce, isn't it, what's going on? Like you said, two extremes really clashing now over this.
One of maybe the germinating moments of the film was sitting in that courtroom with Katya's father and him just saying about the two sides, the prosecution and defense, that there are two Russias here that really hate each other and don't know how to speak to one another at all. And I think that, the conservative elements in society have, for the time being, are using this and are using kind of a radicalism of the left to promote their own interests, unfortunately. And that's an example of anti-gay legislation.
Mm-hmm. And they've actually connected that in the I don't know if it's the media or it sounds like it's from inside Russia, that they've made there are implications that this is caused by Pussy Riot. There's been the authorities' sort of stance on this, is that this is nothing to do with our society. This is violent clashes caused by the fact that Pussy Riot made that statement. So it's as if anything going on over there is now being linked back to them.
Yeah, because they're the most visible, and they've all often been very, very open about supporting LGBT rights.
No, but I think it's a sign of enormous fear and weakness on behalf of the regime that suddenly, in the last 6 months, so many new restrictive laws and anti-gay and anti-freedom of speech laws have been introduced. I mean, it's like a perceived crisis on their behalf, and indeed the punishment of Pussy Riot and the persecution of them was also a part of that. I mean, what the hell are they really afraid of? And they're afraid of a very real seismic shift in generational thinking, I think, and so in a way, it's a compliment to it is.
And that's a long game.
And that's the long game, and so it is. They are protesting too much, perhaps, about something that is not such a high-profile thing, certainly outside of Moscow. So we'll see.
Let's take it back to the women for now. I mean, in terms of where they're at right now, Katya, of course, being released, Nadya and Masha, we use their nicknames, still in the penal colonies. But how do you feel in terms of hope for the future, linking that also, I suppose, to a possible second documentary or further documentaries around the group? From what you've heard, and where do you think that they're heading? I mean, you've said, Maxim, that this is only the beginning, in a way, and they're strategizing. But do you see this as... Do you feel that's energetic wave almost taking place right now that you'd like to follow? Is that the general feeling amongst you?
I think amongst them it's unclear how they can proceed, partially because the whole idea of the group was to do these very secretive, unexpected, spontaneous guerrilla performances, and given the kind of exposure they've had, both in terms of exposure to the authorities as well as exposure internationally in terms of the media, it's very hard to proceed. From jail, we joke that Masha might be the president of Russia, and she does want to go into politics. I think Nadya apparently wants to go back to grad school and study philosophy and continue studying philosophy because she's a philosopher. But in general, I think they want to continue doing political art. And for them, this idea of non-commercial and art that's not commodified and that's not done for profit but used to transform society is the line that they'll pursue, whether it's in Pussy Riot or in other groups.
Yeah, and as artists, their work is constantly evolving. So don't expect a rerun of Pussy Riot necessarily. I mean, I'm sure they would come up with equally ingenious and effective ways of pursuing their goals. I mean, I think they're probably, I don't know, they probably, as I say, probably don't want to come back out wearing balaclavas and doing this stuff, but we'll see. I mean, they're young. I mean, they're not about to retire, and obviously we all wait in anticipation to see what they will do next.
Very quickly, if you can just think off the top of your head, a moving moment, a moment when you actually got to meet the families and you got deep into the story. Do you have one moment that you sometimes talk about that it really hit you that this is an important project? It's something that the girls said, for example, or something that you saw while you were shooting footage, or any?
Well, for me, it was standing outside the cathedral the day after the first bail hearing, and in the company of 100,000 Orthodox believers who were there to be told how insulted they'd been by a video that, of course, they'd never seen. So the idea that it had this potency and this capability of stirring up such incredible reaction, that was historic and epic and terrifying as well in many ways.
That's also what made us realize that this, the punk prayer will probably go down in history as the most controversial and resonant piece of performance art ever. Again, if you compare it to other things, to Joseph Beuys or Kiss Christ or anything else, it's really the kind of controversy that's created. Nothing else really compares to it. And I think for me it was probably that moment of sitting in the courtroom of Katya's father and seeing that, and also just actually seeing the trial and seeing that. What was so fascinating was that the trial was so typical in so many ways, from the sentence that they received to everything else, to just the proceedings moving as they did. And that, by making a film about that, we were trying to show that this excessively punitive nature of the judicial system that exists, and it exists for both high-profile cases and regular cases. And, and the women themselves say that. And then also just being in the presence of their closing speeches and actually listening to that and feeling like this will be something that you can tell people that you were at, and that will be incredibly significant. That this, I think, they will go down as great monuments to free speech and artistic expression. So.